There was something remarkable about Lily. She was small in stature, but her appetite was legendary. While most people struggled to eat just a normal-sized meal, Lily could devour mountains of food without ever seeming to grow even a millimeter wider. She was the kind of girl who could finish off an entire pizza, a stack of pancakes, a bowl of pasta, and still crave dessert afterward. Her friends always marveled at how she could eat so much without any visible consequences. Lily lived in a quiet town, where her days were filled with trips to her favorite bakery, the corner diner, and the occasional all-you-can-eat buffet. She was always on the hunt for the next best meal, the next greatest feast to sink her teeth into. Her love of food wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was a deep, soulful connection to the joy that food brought her. The tastes, the textures, the comforting warmth of a hearty dish, it all made her feel alive in a way nothing else did. But there was one thing that made Lily's situation even more unusual. Despite eating like a glutton, she was impossibly slim. Not just thin, but petite, almost childlike in her frame. It wasn't that she exercised excessively or watched what she ate. She simply could not gain weight. It was a mystery to everyone around her, and though some were envious, Lily never thought much of it. She was simply enjoying her meals to the fullest. On one warm, sunny afternoon, Lily decided to visit a new restaurant that had opened in town. The local buzz had been all about its special feast of the gods, a massive meal meant for the hungriest of souls. Word was that it was impossible to finish in one sitting, and no one had ever attempted to do so. Naturally, Lily was intrigued. She had to try it. When she arrived, the restaurant's owner greeted her with a proud smile, aware of her reputation. "The Feast of the Gods is something special," he said, leading her to a grand table laden with all kinds of food. Roasted meats, vegetables, massive pies, cakes, and fruits piled high in extravagant displays. The entire table looked like it could feed a family of 10 or more. Lily's eyes gleamed with excitement as she sat down. The owner placed the first course before her, a large roasted turkey with all the trimmings. It was as if the meal was designed just for her, a feast fit for a queen. She dug in immediately, savoring each bite as she enjoyed the moment. The warmth of the food, the richness of the flavors, it was all perfect. Unbeknownst to Lily, amidst the mounds of food, a small figure was making its own way through the feast. A tiny man, no taller than a few inches, had managed to sneak his way onto the table. He had been scavenging for food, trying to find crumbs to survive. He hadn't expected Lily to be so ravenous, nor did he know that she would unknowingly be about to consume the very food he had been eyeing. As Lily took a scoop of mashed potatoes with her spoon, she accidentally picked up the tiny man, who was trying to steal a bit of turkey from the spoon's edge. The little man had no time to react before the spoon came rushing toward her mouth, and before he could even yell out, she had taken the bite, swallowing both the potatoes and him whole. Inside Lily's mouth, the tiny man tumbled and fell as the food settled in her warm, wet mouth. It was disorienting at first. The last thing he remembered was being on the edge of a mashed potato scoop, eyes wide as the giant spoon sped toward him. Now, he was trapped in the moist, cavernous space of her mouth, surrounded by warm food that had a somewhat comforting aroma. The tiny man tried to shout, but his voice was barely a squeak compared to the enormous space he found himself in. He scrambled, disoriented, his tiny hands trying to grab onto something to stop himself from sliding toward the back of her throat. He opened his mouth, hoping to yell for help, but the sheer size of the mouth around him made his attempts futile. Lily, however, was too focused on the meal in front of her to notice anything unusual. She hummed contentedly as she continued to devour the food. She took another bite, another scoop of mashed potatoes, and then a piece of pie. Her stomach was already feeling pleasantly full, but she wasn't about to stop. The Feast of the Gods was just getting started. As she continued to eat, the tiny man was helplessly carried along with the food, tumbling toward the back of her throat. With each gulp, he felt himself being pulled deeper into the warm, dark recesses of her throat. He tried to cry out louder, but it was no use. The sound of Lily's chewing and swallowing drowned out any noise he could make. Before he knew it, he was pushed into the tight, muscular walls of her esophagus, sliding downward in a journey that felt both terrifying and surreal. It was as though he had entered an entirely different world, one that was dark, wet, and claustrophobic. The sheer pressure of Lily's swallowing made him feel as if he were being squeezed into oblivion. Meanwhile, Lily continued to eat, completely unaware of the tiny man trapped within her. The sensation of fullness was starting to settle in, and she could feel her stomach stretching with every bite. She rubbed her belly contentedly, the growing sensation of satisfaction taking over. She had eaten so much that she could almost feel the weight of it all inside her, like a food baby, swollen and content. The tiny man was now swallowed whole. His world immediately transformed from the vast, open space of the table to the overwhelming, insular expanse of Lily's stomach. His sense of direction was gone. The air, thick with the scent of rich food and the faint, tangy tang of digestion, pressed against him from all sides. He blinked, trying to adjust to the damp, humid atmosphere that enveloped him, his tiny body trembling at the sheer scale of everything around him. The stomach itself was a cavernous, fleshy environment, its walls soft yet unyielding, pulsating with rhythmic contractions that seemed to come from deep within. It was as if the stomach were alive, breathing, expanding and contracting in a constant, undulating rhythm, powered by Lily's body. The warmth that radiated from the walls was overwhelming, not unpleasant but certainly intense, almost suffocating. The air felt thick, heavy with the sound of digestion. Gurgles, sloshes, and faint growls echoed from deep within, mingling with the sound of Lily's heartbeat, a soft but constant thrum that seemed to shake the very walls around him. The tiny man swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the constant moisture in the air. He tried to move, but the ground beneath him was slippery, the surface smooth and slick with stomach acids. The soft, spongy texture of the stomach lining was like an alien terrain, squishy and unpredictable with each step he took. The environment felt both fluid and solid at the same time, a strange contradiction. The faint warmth of Lily's body seeped into his very skin, but it wasn't just the heat that made the space feel alive. It was the way the walls moved. The way the very space seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, a reminder of the colossal power contained in the body of the girl who unknowingly housed him. The walls of the stomach pressed in on him, gently, but with an undeniable force. He could feel the muscles contracting, the walls tightening as the stomach began its work, churning and grinding the food Lily had so greedily devoured into smaller, more manageable pieces. It was a gradual process, but it was relentless. The tiny man was tossed and turned with every movement, as though he were nothing more than another piece of food to be processed and broken down. It was impossible to hold on to anything, as the environment was too slick, too unforgiving. Every few seconds, the stomach's walls would tighten with a deep, reverberating growl that would send him sliding in a new direction, helpless to the whims of the digestive process. He gasped, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his heart racing. Panic rose within him, but he couldn't let it take over. The overwhelming size of this stomach, its relentless motion, made him feel as though he were a mere speck of dust in the grand scale of Lily's body. Every step he took was like trying to walk up a steep hill, only for the stomach to push him back with its insistent motion. The heat was suffocating, the air so thick with the scent of food that it burned his nostrils. But there was more. As the stomach churned around him, the sound of her digestion filled the space. It was a constant, low rumble deep within, an unyielding growl that seemed to emanate from every corner. The sounds were amplified here, as though he were trapped in a world of guttural echoes. The gurgles were not only the stomach's rhythmic work, they were also a reminder of his own vulnerability. Each sound, each pulse, felt like a drumbeat heralding his fate. He could almost hear the food breaking down, the acids mixing with the remnants of what Lily had consumed, breaking it all into a state where it could be absorbed and processed into energy. The tiny man wanted to scream, to call out, but he knew it would be futile. His voice was so small compared to the vastness of the space he now inhabited. The walls of the stomach were too thick, the growls of digestion too loud to make an impact. His body was too tiny for any of his efforts to be noticed by the giantess who had unknowingly trapped him inside her. She was blissfully unaware, her body continuing its natural process of processing the food she had eaten. He took a shaky breath, trying to steel himself against the environment. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but they were quickly replaced by fear. How could he possibly escape this? He was trapped inside her body, a speck of life in a vast, unknowable world. He had no choice but to endure. As the minutes passed, the tiny man's body grew accustomed to the constant movement, the shifting of the stomach walls pressing in on him from all sides. It was no longer just the feeling of heat and tightness, but an overwhelming sense of being part of the process. His every move was being dictated by Lily's body, her digestive system slowly breaking down everything she had consumed: food, drink, and the small, unfortunate man who had ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The walls of the stomach seemed to close in on him with each contraction, the stomach's muscles grinding and kneading the food with gentle but firm pressure. He could feel the walls pressing in from all sides, the movement pushing him closer and closer to the center of the stomach, where everything would eventually be broken down. The acidic fluids began to churn around him, their warmth turning into a biting sting against his skin. The air grew heavier, thicker with the scent of food and digestion. Every breath felt more difficult, as though the very air he was inhaling was part of the digestive process itself. It was as if the very space around him was alive. The stomach wasn't just a place of digestion, it was a living, breathing entity that was processing everything that Lily had consumed, including him. The tiny man felt the weight of it, the weight of being trapped inside something so immense, so all-encompassing. The walls of the stomach tightened again, and the tiny man was pushed further down, sliding through the slick, slippery surface. The digestive acids were now stronger, the warmth of the stomach's inner workings pressing in even more, as if it were preparing to send the food deeper into the digestive tract. He could feel the pull of her body, the muscular movements pushing him toward an uncertain fate. But even amidst the growing despair, there was a part of him that refused to give up. He had come this far, had survived this much. The stomach was enormous and overwhelming, but he couldn't give in to the suffocating feelings of panic. He would keep moving. He would hold on. Somehow, someway he would survive this and find a way out. The journey, however harrowing, was far from over. But deep within the churning stomach, the tiny man still had hope. He could feel it, just beneath the surface of fear and panic, a tiny spark of determination. There had to be a way out. He wouldn't let this stomach be his grave. Inside Lily's vast stomach, the tiny man felt the weight of his situation settling in. The walls around him seemed alive, constantly shifting and moving, as if they were aware of his presence but indifferent to his struggles. He had no idea how he had ended up in this strange, dark place, and the more he tried to move, the more he realized just how powerless he was. The air was thick, saturated with the scent of food that was slowly being broken down by the stomach's acidic environment. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. How could he escape from this living, churning prison? There were no doors, no windows, just the soft, undulating walls of Lily's stomach, the digestive fluids that gently sloshed around him, and the rhythmic sounds of her body working tirelessly to break down the food she had consumed. He had no choice but to wait and endure. But with each passing second, he grew more anxious. The stomach was a vast, unforgiving space, and though it was warm and comforting in a way, it was also claustrophobic. Every time he tried to move, the stomach walls seemed to press in on him, as though they were intentionally pushing him back. He could feel the muscles contracting and relaxing around him, like a powerful force trying to break down every last piece of food inside her. The tiny man tried to calm himself, but panic set in. His thoughts raced, thinking of ways to make himself heard. What if he could shout louder, bang against the walls of the stomach, or somehow catch Lily's attention? But his voice was too small. His body was too tiny. He was completely at the mercy of the massive girl, and all he could do was endure the slow, steady progress of digestion. Meanwhile, Lily was still sitting at the table, contentedly leaning back with her hands resting on her swollen belly. She had eaten so much, and yet she didn't feel full in the usual way. Instead of feeling stuffed and uncomfortable, she felt satisfied, as though she had found a perfect balance. Her stomach was distended, but there was no pain, no discomfort. Just contentment. Her fingers traced over her belly button once more, feeling the soft curve of her stomach as it pressed outward. It was a strange sensation, but she liked it. She had never felt so full yet so peaceful at the same time. The food had been so delicious, and the feeling of fullness was just the cherry on top of a perfect meal. She closed her eyes for a moment, lost in the sensation of her body digesting the massive feast she had consumed. But little did she know, deep inside her, the tiny man was still struggling. The more time passed, the more his surroundings grew more oppressive. He could feel the acidity of the stomach fluids creeping closer, the sensation of the walls closing in on him. The warm, wet environment felt like it was suffocating him, and every breath was heavy, as though the air itself was thick with the scent of food and digestion. The walls of her stomach contracted around him once more, and he felt the pressure increase. It was as if the digestive process was speeding up, forcing him toward the deeper parts of the digestive tract. With every movement, he was pushed forward, sliding along the slick, mucus-lined surface of the stomach. There was no stopping the journey. He had no control over what was happening to him. At this point, the tiny man could barely remember what it had felt like to be outside, free and able to move around without any restrictions. He had been so focused on the food, so eager to grab whatever scraps he could find, that he had never imagined anything like this could happen. How had it gone so wrong? How had he ended up in this strange, terrifying world inside Lily's body? As he was pushed deeper into her stomach, he caught a glimpse of the rhythmic contractions of the stomach lining. It seemed to pulse with an almost mechanical precision, moving him along like an unyielding conveyor belt. There was no stopping it. The pressure built, and he realized with growing horror that he was being propelled toward the next stage of digestion. He was being broken down. The tiny man's mind was in a frenzy. He could feel himself being moved along the slippery walls, his body helplessly sliding with the force of the stomach's contractions. His surroundings were oppressive, dark, damp, and stifling. He struggled to stay calm, but the reality of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't a dream. He was trapped inside the stomach of a giantess. As he was pushed deeper, he noticed something else. A faint thrum of energy, a feeling that the walls of the stomach were closing in even more. He could hear the soft growling sounds of Lily's stomach from above, a constant reminder of the massive body he was trapped inside. The digestive process was well underway, and he could feel himself being slowly submerged in the acids that would break down the food. He had to act. But what could he do? He wasn't strong enough to escape on his own. Even if he somehow managed to climb the slippery walls of her stomach, what then? There was nowhere to go. He was stuck in this never-ending cycle of digestion. The tiny man tried to focus, trying to gather his thoughts. He had to find a way out. But how? Could he shout loud enough to be heard? Could he somehow signal Lily? He doubted it. The sheer size of her body, the vastness of the space inside her, made it impossible for him to even fathom a way to communicate with her. He let out a small sigh, feeling utterly defeated. His only hope now was to hold on, to wait for the digestive process to eventually work itself out. Perhaps when the food was fully broken down, he would be expelled, released into the next stage of the digestive system. But the thought of spending even more time trapped in the dark, humid depths of Lily's stomach filled him with dread. Meanwhile, Lily was blissfully unaware of the turmoil happening inside her. She leaned back in her chair, content with the meal she had just devoured. Her stomach was swollen and round, a soft bulge in her midsection, but she didn't feel uncomfortable. She had never been one to feel the negative effects of overeating. Her body simply processed the food, and she felt the satisfaction of having indulged in a true feast. She rubbed her belly gently, her fingers tracing circles around her navel. The feeling of fullness was unlike anything she had experienced before, almost as though the food had become a part of her, merging with her very being. It was a comforting sensation, one that made her feel safe and warm. But as her fingers gently moved across her stomach, she paused for a moment, feeling a subtle flutter deep within. It was the faintest sensation, a small ripple against her skin, but it was enough to make her stop. She frowned slightly, wondering if she had imagined it. Had something inside her moved? It was impossible to tell. Her mind dismissed the thought almost immediately. Lily let out a soft sigh, a smile forming on her lips. She was so full, so content. She didn't have any more room for worry or doubt. All she needed to do now was relax and let the meal settle. But deep inside her, the tiny man's ordeal was far from over. The digestive process continued its relentless march forward. The tiny man was helpless in the face of it all. The walls around him tightened and constricted with each passing moment, squeezing the food he had been trapped inside into smaller, more digestible pieces. He could feel the heat of the acids that were slowly breaking down everything that had once been a meal, and the sensation was overwhelming. It was as though he were slowly sinking into an abyss, with no escape in sight. The pressure in the stomach increased, pushing him further toward the pyloric valve, where the food would eventually be expelled into the small intestine. The tiny man could only brace himself against the powerful forces that surrounded him, holding on to whatever part of the stomach lining he could grasp, even though it was futile. His body, once filled with energy and life, now felt limp and weak as the acidic environment around him took its toll. The warmth of the stomach was almost comforting, but the acidic fluids that sloshed around him were beginning to feel more intense, more corrosive. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was no longer just a passive participant in this process. He was being broken down like everything else Lily had eaten. But just as despair began to settle in, he remembered something that gave him a glimmer of hope. If he could survive this, perhaps he could find a way to escape. After all, he had already survived the initial swallowing. Maybe he could endure this next phase too. His thoughts were interrupted as the pressure around him increased once more, and the tiny man was propelled forward, deeper into Lily's digestive system. The journey within Lily's body felt like an eternity. The tiny man had already been through the stomach's relentless churning and the oppressive warmth of its digestive juices. But now, as he was pushed deeper, the journey took a new turn. A place far darker, far more intimate than he could have ever imagined. Lily's stomach had done its job, breaking down the food into a mushy pulp. The digestion was no longer as slow and careful as before. Her body, efficient and tireless, had begun to push the remnants of her meal through to the next phase, the small intestine. The walls of the stomach slowly gave way to something entirely different. The transition was immediate and intense. The space was still warm, but there was a slight shift in the air, a subtle cooling as the food was pushed down toward the duodenum, the first section of her small intestine. It felt almost like a release, as if the stomach's pressure had eased up, but that was only an illusion. The tiny man was still being pulled relentlessly downward, driven by the unceasing rhythm of Lily's digestive system. The wall around him, still slick and smooth, was now different. It had a new texture, a slightly more fibrous, delicate feeling, but the relentless contraction of muscles was still just as powerful, if not more so. At first, the tiny man thought he might be able to get some relief. But as the walls of the stomach gave way to the entrance of the small intestine, a new kind of pressure started to build. The muscles of Lily's body didn't just push him forward with their normal rhythm. There was a different force at play now, a more forceful, pulsing wave of movement that compressed him further into the digestive tract. The walls of the intestine moved in tighter, swirling around him, and he could feel his body being squeezed with each contraction, as though the very walls themselves were attempting to digest him. The small intestine was both alien and fascinating. The walls were lined with tiny finger-like projections called villi, which helped absorb nutrients from the food being broken down. The environment felt softer here, more fluid, but also more dangerous. The air was thicker, denser with digestive fluids, and the acidic sting of the stomach was still present in his skin, though somewhat diluted by the more neutralizing environment of the intestines. Still, the discomfort was far from over. The walls pressed on him from all sides, their motions deliberate, pushing everything, including him, forward. The forceful contractions of the muscles acted like a relentless tide, sending him further into the narrow, winding intestines. As he was swept along by the movements of Lily's body, the tiny man could feel the air shift. The smell of digestion intensified, a strong organic scent that made his stomach churn in sympathy. It was thick with the scent of processed food, bile, and the ongoing breakdown of organic material. Every breath he took seemed to fill his lungs with a mixture of discomfort and despair, yet it also fueled his resolve. The thought of escape flickered faintly in his mind, though it was growing more distant with each passing moment. Every now and then he would be pushed up against the smooth, squishy walls of the intestine, the cool, slimy surface slick with digestive fluid. The pressure felt like a vice, squeezing him with such intensity that he felt his body being flattened, his bones bending under the force. The constant, rhythmic pulse of the intestinal walls grew louder and louder, filling the space with a drumming sound that echoed in his ears. He had no choice but to move along with the relentless flow, swept deeper into the maze of the digestive tract. It felt as though the walls of the intestine were closing in on him, as if the very space itself was constricting, making every breath more difficult, every movement more strained. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort. There was something more terrifying about this part of the journey. The small intestine was vast, winding like a long tunnel. It stretched for meters, each twist and turn filled with new sensations, new dangers. The tiny man felt incredibly small here, almost insignificant. He was surrounded by the powerful digestive forces of Lily's body, and it seemed as though the path before him was endless. And yet, even amidst the terrifying vastness, he couldn't help but be awed by the complexity of it all. The way the body worked, how the muscles and fluids operated in such perfect harmony, it was a testament to the raw, unstoppable power of life itself. There was a sense of awe that rose within him, a fragile recognition of how remarkable the human body was. This was life at its most primal, at its most raw. It was beautiful in its terrifying, relentless efficiency. He was inside a living being, a giantess whose very body was processing everything, including him. The power of it was immense. At moments, the tiny man was able to catch his breath, his mind racing as he thought about the distance he had traveled. He tried to remember the way he had entered her, how everything had seemed so sudden, how he had been swept up in the chaotic motion of her body. Now, trapped inside, there was no sense of direction. He was completely disoriented. The world around him was a labyrinth of organs, each working in concert to break down what Lily had consumed. There was no clear path ahead, only the overwhelming pressure of movement. He could feel the walls pulling him further and further into the bowels of her body. The smell, the sensation, the heat, it was all becoming too much. His body felt fragile against the onslaught of forces around him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could endure this. The pain, the disorientation, the constant pressure on his body, it all seemed to blend together into a single overwhelming experience. But in the midst of the struggle, a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. He realized that, in this moment, he had become part of something much larger than himself. His body was being transformed, altered by the very forces that had brought him here. He was a part of Lily, a tiny, insignificant speck in the immense landscape of her digestive system. And yet he was here. He had survived this far, and somehow, that survival had become a kind of victory. His heart raced, his mind struggling to find some meaning in the bizarre and terrifying experience. Each moment that passed felt like an eternity. Every movement he made, every attempt to free himself, was only met with more forceful contraction from the walls around him. But there was still a faint glimmer of hope, a small flicker of possibility. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he was certain of one thing: he couldn't give up. Not yet. For the first time since being swallowed, the tiny man found himself focusing on something other than the physical pain. He remembered that there was a way out of this, a way to escape the suffocating hold of Lily's body. It might be a long road ahead, but he was determined to find a way through, whatever it took. And so, with the undulating pulse of Lily's body surrounding him, the tiny man pressed on, deeper into the vast living maze of her body. The journey was far from over, but with each passing moment he felt a little more resilient, a little more determined to survive. The pressure increased as the pyloric valve came closer. The tiny man could feel his body being compressed, as though he were entering a new phase of his journey. His vision was blurry, and the temperature around him seemed to rise, the intense heat of Lily's stomach giving way to the warm, thick environment of her small intestine. As he passed through the pyloric valve, the world around him changed once again. The familiar, oppressive warmth of the stomach faded, replaced by the slightly cooler, yet still humid environment of the intestine. The walls of the intestine were slick and slippery, and the tiny man slid along the surface, propelled by the constant undulating motions of Lily's digestive system. This new space was no less intimidating. The walls of the intestine pulsed around him, pushing everything forward. The tiny man struggled to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing solid to grab. The air was thick with the smell of digested food, and the space felt even tighter than the stomach. It was as though there was no escape, no way out, and the walls seemed to close in on him from every direction. He gasped for air, his body exhausted from the ordeal. His entire existence had been reduced to this struggle, this endless battle to survive within the body of someone so much larger than him. He had no idea if anyone would ever find him, or if he would be lost forever inside Lily's body. The thought of never escaping was a suffocating weight on his mind. But then, just as his spirit began to falter, he heard something. A sound, faint but undeniable. It was a rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat, but not coming from within his own chest. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper inside her. For a moment he couldn't make sense of it, but then it hit him. It was the sound of Lily's body, her pulse, her very life force. The movement that had carried him all this way was still there, alive, still pulsing with energy. The tiny man realized something. He wasn't trapped forever. There was a way out. Lily's body, though it was an enormous and intimidating force, was still a living entity. It was constantly moving, constantly shifting. There was still a chance he could find his way back out if he could just hold on a little longer. The tiny man fought against the instinctive feeling of surrender that crept into his thoughts. It would be so easy to give in, to let the digestive process finish and be completely absorbed. But that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want to become just another part of Lily's body, another piece of food lost forever in the depths of her digestion. He had to escape. He fought against the smooth walls of the intestine, pushing himself forward with every ounce of strength he could muster. The rhythm of her body, the pulsating waves of the digestive process, continued to carry him along, but he used it to his advantage. Every contraction of her intestines gave him a little more momentum. He was close to the end now, and he could feel it. The sensation of being sucked forward intensified, but so did his determination. The closer he came to the end of his journey, the stronger the pull became. The intestinal walls grew tighter and more intense, but he kept pushing, using the last of his energy to claw forward. And then, just when he thought he could go no further, he felt something incredible. A shift in pressure, a sudden release, as though the body was preparing to expel everything that had been swallowed. And then, with a sudden rush, he was expelled, pushed forward by the force of Lily's digestive process. The tiny man tumbled out, landing in a soft, warm mass. The moment he hit the surface, the world around him seemed to shift. He was no longer inside Lily. The sounds of her body faded, replaced by the cool air of the outside world. He had made it. He gasped for air, his body trembling from the intensity of what he had just gone through. It had been an ordeal like no other. He had survived the unthinkable, trapped inside a giantess's body, at the mercy of her digestive system. But now, as he lay on the soft ground, catching his breath, he realized that he had somehow made it out. He had survived. As he stood up, feeling the fresh air on his skin, he turned around to look at the massive form of Lily, still blissfully unaware of the tiny man who had been inside her. She sat at the table, her stomach round and full, a contented smile on her face. She rubbed her belly, still unaware of the battle that had just taken place within her. The tiny man didn't know what to do next. Should he confront her? Should he try to explain what had happened? Or should he simply walk away, knowing that his encounter with her had been nothing more than an accidental tragedy? He paused, looking up at her massive, unsuspecting form. It was then that he realized something important. Despite everything that had happened, despite the terror and the darkness of his journey inside her, there was something profound about the experience. It had tested his limits, made him stronger in ways he hadn't anticipated. And now, standing here, free from the depths of her body, he felt a sense of gratitude for surviving. He smiled to himself, deciding not to approach her. There were no words that could explain what had happened. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the giantess to her feast and the world of the tiny man to continue. The journey, however harrowing, had ended, and in a strange way the tiny man had found freedom.